Hello and welcome to the OTB channel. Today I'm going to do a little bit of a commentary. I'm going to look at the Gnome Code of Conduct and I'm going to ask, is it fit for purpose? A controversial subject? Is it? See you after the intro. Okay, welcome back. So I'm going to do this commentary today, and I thought long and hard about whether I should do this. It's a controversial subject. It's one of those subjects, the Code of Conduct, that has divided the Linux community into separate camps. And when it was first launched, I think it was about a year or so ago, perhaps 18 months ago, I'm not sure of the exact date. Well, Reddit went absolutely ballistic. And we saw YouTube commentators such as DT decrying the whole thing as absolutely racist. And hey, you know, it was one of those subject areas that you didn't really want to touch. So I stayed back at the time. You'll know my views about politics. I don't think really that the free and open source software community should be political. I think it tends to keep what our core objectives are hidden almost. You know, we have some common goals. We're using a free operating system. There are huge benefits to doing that. And in many ways, we have some common ideas and common principles that we all sign up to. So when something is launched that's political, I don't think it actually does the community much good. So I've sort of waited for 12 and 18 months, and I've thought perhaps it's now time to have a look at this, but now that heads are cooler, and to perhaps attempt a balanced view of the Code of Conduct, and to look at the document itself without kind of adopting a political extreme and saying, you know, based on what it's trying to do, is it actually fit for purpose? Does it achieve that? Now, whether I achieve that at the end of this video is going to be down to you guys. It's a hard thing to do because I'm going to try and remain objective, but ultimately there is only so much objectivity that you can bring into something like this, and I'm sure that my views will filter out as I'm chatting, but I'm going to make this as balanced as I possibly can. I'm going to provide a little bit of context about where codes of conduct like Gnome sit, and why it's all come about and why it's controversial, before I go and look at the text itself and see whether the text does its job. Because ultimately what its job is setting the rules of engagement for people in the community to interact with each other. That's what all of these codes of conduct are about. So I'm going to split this video into sections for a couple of reasons. It's going to provide a little bit of structure to the video, and it will also allow me time to think about what I want to say next, because I'm sort of feeling that this is the sort of subject area where I have to tread quite carefully. So let's start off by looking at the context, the social context of why codes of conduct are even required. So let's step back for 1 minute and let's just take a broader view of why people think something like a code of conduct is necessary. And I think you have to start almost by saying that Human beings are incredibly complex things, animals, whatever you want to call them. We all have differing viewpoints, differing opinions. We love to argue and debate with each other. In fact, there are times when I think what's really amazing is that we can manage to come together despite all of our differing opinions. And when we're working together in teams or groups, we can achieve some pretty amazing things. And part of the process of coming together is about us acknowledging that we all do have different views, and we debate with each other and we argue with each other. And ultimately, we get to a point where we come up with a compromise that is acceptable to everybody. Now, you only have to look at something like here in the UK, the context of our parliament, for instance, is based on robust debate. And at times it seems like it's absolute chaos, but we nevertheless still achieve something in the end. And the reason that we achieve something is because despite our differing opinions and views, ultimately, there are more things that unite us than divide us. We have a common goal. So in Linux, if you take Gnome, for example, I'm sure they have a common goal. They want to produce a great desktop environment. Any other aspect of the Linux world, where you've got teams working together, they have a common objective that they are working towards. And that common objective helps to focus people's minds, and ultimately we do achieve things. The things we achieve may sometimes be a compromise. As they say, what's that expression that you can't please all of the people all of the time, but you can please some of the people all of the time. And we are generally accepting of that not everybody is always going to get their own way. Nevertheless, by coming together, we argue and debate with each other, and we do usually achieve wonderful things. Now, that's not to say that sometimes the road can't be rocky. I know here in the UK, we have a culture where we tend to use sarcasm, and we tend to use what we refer to as banter, which can be quite cutting at times. But most of the time, that's delivered in an atmosphere which is full of humour and light-heartedness, and with an expectation that the person who we are directing the banter against is going to banter back and give us a clever, sarcastic comment as well. Now, not everybody understands that, and I'd be the first to admit this is an old boomer's view. We're seeing less of that happening these days. But nevertheless, it was all part and parcel of that robust debate that generally worked and continues to work. The question is, why does it work? Because on the face of it, you'd think, well, people of differing viewpoints, they are never going to agree. They're never going to get on with each other. It's just going to be constant arguments and disagreements. Well, the reason why it works and the reason why we can actually work with each other is because there are certain rules of engagement out there that we all agree with. Whether rules of engagement is the right term, I don't know, but essentially that's what they are. We have some values that most of us agree with. Here in the 21st century, I don't think there's that many people would disagree with the fact that we should all try and show each other due respect, and that things like harassment and bullying and prejudice and discrimination really should have no place in the 21st century. So we have some common things that we do agree with, and they sort of guide what our behaviour is. The thing is, these things are not fixed in stone. They change constantly over time. And over the last decade or so, we've seen a whole range of different changes that have become quite politicized. There's been more focus on the concept of diversity, that we are all different, and that we need to acknowledge different people's characteristics and different people's point of views to a much greater extent than perhaps there was in the past. And in many ways, that's a very good thing. You know, it can only ultimately lead to the pursuit of a more equal and fairer society. At the same time, though, because it's been quite political and politically motivated in many areas, it's also been the subject of a whole range of debates about freedom. Freedom is often at the centre of the rules of engagement and the changes to them. And on the one side, and we're talking extremes here. At one extreme, there are those who view freedom of speech and freedom from censorship to be ultimately what it means to be free. You know, and we should be free to express our views in any way that we wish. On the other extreme, you have those who say that actually that's all very well, but actually you can't have total freedom of speech because not everybody is in a situation where they are free to influence a conversation or to have some sort of impact on the final decision because of their particular position or lack of power in a hierarchy. And therefore, we have to have some rules to make sure that those people retain a freedom to take part, and we may have to take some sort of steps. And some of those steps that we have to take may restrict freedom of speech because they're absolutely necessary in order for us to have a fairer and more reasonable society. Now, I'm putting two extreme points of view here, which I suppose have started to become quite polarized recently into political views associated with the right and political views that are associated with the left. And indeed, with codes of conduct and the Gnome code of conduct, we certainly saw this polarity appearing. Based on the content of the Gnome code of conduct, you only have to look through Reddit. There were some people on the extreme of one end of this debate saying it goes too far, the Gnome code of conduct, it restricts freedom of speech, almost inferring in many ways it's almost like 1984 again, it's a form of social control. And at the other end, you'd have people say, no, it's absolutely necessary if you want equality and you want fair debate and you want to show respect to everybody. And the very fact that you're disagreeing with that suggests that you yourself are racist, homophobic, or whatever else. Oh, so it got quite heated, and it was a reflection in many ways of what we've been seeing happen in society. You only have to look at something like the Brexit debates, and many of those same themes are common. So against that backdrop, where the common things that we all think are important have become more complicated, I'm not surprised that organisations such as Gnome have decided that actually you need to go further. You need to make it absolutely clear what standards of behaviour are acceptable and unacceptable. Not an easy thing to do, and whether they've achieved their objective by doing this is certainly open to debate. So let's move on and let's have a look at the code of conduct itself. So what you should see on the combined screen now, it is not the current GNOME code of conduct, but the old one that was replaced by the new code of conduct. And I thought this might be a good starting place. Perhaps I should say at the beginning, I'm not picking on GNOME here. I could have picked the Free Software Foundation's code of conduct. I could have looked at the Linux code of conduct, the one that the kernel developers are asked to stick to. I could have looked at any of them. It was just GNOME was the first one I really came across and started looking at the debate. So it was just appropriate to look at. So I'm not picking on GNOME specifically. You all know that it isn't my favourite desktop environment, but that doesn't mean that I don't think it makes a valuable contribution to the Linux community more generally, because I do. I also don't blame the motivations of GNOME for putting a code of conduct together. I really think that they felt some sort of rules of engagement really needed to be written down, and that would only help. And if we look at this old code of conduct, I don't see anything in it that looks too extreme or something really that would put me off signing up for it. I mean, let's have a look. The summary. GNOME creates software for a better world, and we achieve this by behaving well towards each other. Okay, great. This document suggests what we consider ideal behaviour, so you know what we expect if you're getting involved in GNOME. This is who we are and what we want to be. There's no official enforcement of these principles, and it should not be interpreted as a legal document. Great. I'm all for this so far. And then you basically have 4 bullets. Be respectful and considerate. Be patient and generous. Assume people mean well and try to be concise. So there's nothing, extreme here. So be respectful and considerate. So disagreement's no excuse for poor behaviour or personal attacks. Remember, in a community where people feel uncomfortable, it's not likely to be productive. Common sense. Be patient and generous. If someone asks for help, it's because they need it. So, give it to them and avoid aggressive or vague responses such as the classic RTFM. Read the flipping manual. I find this one particularly interesting. Assume people mean well. So remember that decisions are often a difficult choice between competing priorities, which is what I've just been saying, really. If you disagree, please do so politely. And if something seems outrageous, check that you didn't misinterpret it. Ask for clarification. Don't assume the worst. So this is all about, don't suddenly jump on it. Don't be offended. There's this big thing about offence at the moment, isn't there? Don't be offended automatically. Take time and think about what's actually been said. Perhaps have a sense of humour. We all have different views and we're all entitled to them. To me, that is absolutely common sense. And last but not least, try to be concise. Stop repeating what's already been said. It just slows the whole process down. So that's essentially it. So my view of the old code of conduct is great. Sign me up. Haven't got an issue with any of it. Absolutely common sense, and I can see where they're coming from. Well done, GNOME. Great. So why, oh why, did you need to go and introduce a new one? So, now you see on the screen the new GNOME code of conduct. And the first thing that I would say about it is that it's not really sticking to one of the principles that it mentioned on its previous code of conduct, which was to be precise. Yeah, it's a lot longer. Longer does not necessarily mean it's worse, but let's go through it and see what it says. So thanks for being part of the Gnome project. We value your participation and want everyone to have an enjoyable and fulfilling experience. Yeah, great. Accordingly, all participants are expected to follow this code of conduct and to show respect, understanding and consideration to one another. Thanks for helping make this a welcoming, friendly community for everyone. Okay, I don't have a problem with that. I think most of us can get behind that. It's great. Where does it apply? So these are all the various places that it applies, and then there's a little bit of clarification here. Then we go down to our standards. And this, in my view, and I know I said I was going to be objective, and I'm going to be as objective as I possibly can here. This, for me, is where it starts to break apart a little bit. And I'll explain why I feel that. So the Gnome community is dedicated to providing a positive experience of everyone, regardless of all of these various characteristics. So, on the plus side, this is an acknowledgement of the fact that we live in a diverse society, and Gnome is trying to show that it recognises that we do live in a diverse society, and it's bringing all these individual things up. So age, body size, caste, citizenship, disability, etc., etc. My issue with lists like this is quite simple, actually. Whilst I think it's important to acknowledge diversity, and I feel from an analytical point of view, the fact that we all have different characteristics can be incredibly useful when you're trying to figure out why inequality exists and how we can make society better. However, when it's listed in a document like this, I think what it tends to do is it tends to point out why we are all different. It emphasises our differences over and above those things that unite us. Remember I said earlier that despite the fact that we're all different, one of the reasons that we can work together is we have common goals to work towards. And I believe this sort of thing emphasises difference over those common goals, and common goals can get lost in the mix. The other problem I have with a list like this is it's quite imprecise, and you're always going to risk missing some sort of characteristic off there that certain individuals might think are important. So creating a full list is almost an impossibility. We do live in a diverse society. We are all very different. I mean, I'm just taking myself here for an instance. So age, okay, I'm an old bloke. Body size, I'm overweight, that's for sure. Caste, citizenship, disability, education, ethnicity, okay, I'm white. Familial status, I take it that means am I married or whatever. I might be completely wrong. I'm going to leave the gender and sexual orientation stuff until after. Genetic information, immigration status, level of experience, nationality. Oh, and so it goes on. Personal appearance. What does that cover? I'm bald. I don't know. It's imprecise because these are just headings almost, and you really need to break them down into their component parts to understand what they're actually about. But my view is that they emphasise difference over what we are all trying to achieve. And so I much prefer the older code of conduct because of that. I also think this is trying to be too political and too politically correct. It uses words and expressions that I had to go and look up to see exactly what they mean. Let's take gender and sexual identity and characteristics like that. So we have gender expression, gender identity, sex characteristics, sexual orientation, sexual identity. And I looked at those different things and I thought, I'm not entirely sure what the difference is between something like gender identity and sexual identity, and what's the difference between gender identity and gender expression. And I did some Googling, and where are we? And so I did find an article here, and apparently gender identity is how somebody actually sees themselves, their own internal sense and personal experience of gender, whereas gender expression is how a person outwardly shows their gender identity. Okay. Sexual characteristics and sexual orientation, I wasn't entirely sure of. Sex characteristics, I did another Google search, and that seemed to suggest to me that encompass things such as the biological differences between the sexes. Because I was going to ask, where are biological differences here? They don't really seem to be there. Sexual orientation, sexual identity, these things were not immediately obvious to me in terms of what their precise meaning was. And I think that any document like this, if you have to go off and do a Google search or look up in a dictionary what it actually means, it's missing the point. In its attempt to be overtly politically correct, it just confuses and muddies the water. I'm sure that all of these things are really important to particular people, and that's great, but I don't think it's useful to list them like this. We then go down to community guidelines. And what they've essentially done here is they've tried to break up what we saw on the original code of conduct, the advice that they gave, and they're now under a heading community guidelines. So be friendly, be empathetic, be respectful, be considerate, be patient and generous, and try to be concise. Okay, so on the face of it, these look like they've just broken out what we saw before that I didn't have a problem with. Can you see what's missing? What's missing is that particular point here that I thought was well said. Assume people mean well. This was the point that says, don't jump on what someone says straight away. Think about what they've said, ask them to repeat it, be generous in your interpretation of what they actually mean. That's disappeared altogether. Do we not have to assume people mean well anymore? It would seem not. So at best, it's poorly worded, and it was a poor decision to take that out. So let's move on. Inappropriate behaviour. Community members asked to stop any appropriate behaviour are expected to comply immediately. We all want participants in the Gnome community to have the best possible experience they can. In order to be clear what that means, we've provided a list of examples. Okay, so let's have a look. Some of these are straightforward. Deliberate intimidation, stalking or following. Okay, fair enough. Sustained disruption of online discussion. Harassment of people who don't drink alcohol or other legal substances. Okay, fine. Did Gnome have a problem with people drinking too much? I don't know. Sexist, racist, homophobic, transphobic, ableist language or otherwise exclusionary language. So this includes deliberately referring to someone by a gender that they do not identify with, and or questioning the legitimacy of an individual's gender identity. If you're unsure if a word is derogatory, don't use it. This also includes repeated subtle or indirect discrimination. This is where I start to worry. I don't think people should purposely offend or go out to offend. But surely there is a point where we have to say, if the situation is so complex, and this is painting a really complex picture, can we say, well, I suppose includes deliberately referring to someone by a gender they do not identify with? You wouldn't always know what gender a person identifies with, so you could make a mistake. It would not be deliberate. It could simply be an assumption. So I think it's quite dangerous to use language like this. And it does sort of seem to be quite hard line. Exclusionary language. What exactly is meant by the term exclusionary language? It's certainly a politically correct term, but it's not concise and it's not that clear. Subtle and/or indirect discrimination. I'm not entirely sure what that means. We hear talk these days of things such as minor aggressions, which I haven't quite wrapped my head around. So yeah, I think I could probably have a problem with this particular paragraph. Unwelcome sexual attention or behaviour that contributes to a sexualised environment. Sexualised comments, jokes, okay, fine. I think that makes sense. Unwelcome physical contact. Okay, yeah. Violence or threats of violence. Yeah, okay, fine. Influence or encouraging inappropriate behaviour. Fine. Possession of an offensive weapon at a Gnome event. Fine. Okay. So far then, it uses imprecise language. It's much longer, and so it certainly isn't concise. It, to my mind, focuses on difference rather than those common things that we should be working for. Now, I understand why it's like this. I think Gnome have themselves been influenced by the social context of what's happening, and they've wanted to be seen to do the right thing. I just think that so far it's creating a little bit of confusion for me. And I think that if you have to go off and you have to look up a dictionary for some of the terms that it's talking about, already it's not fit for purpose. And we haven't yet looked at the most controversial aspect. Okay, so let's go and look at this last section, which appears to have been the focus for most of the criticisms. And I noticed that since the original criticisms appeared all over the place, including DT's video where he called it racist, a particular sentence has been taken out. So, and it's in this safety versus comfort section. So we have this first statement here. The Gnome community prioritises marginalised people's safety over privileged people's comfort. Okay, I talked about being imprecise. What exactly do we mean by marginalised people, and what exactly do we mean by privileged people? There's been lots of talk about, inherent privilege recently in the news and in various debates. And privileged is often referring to, white males or white people generally as being privileged in some way. And okay, fine. But who are marginalised people? The Gnome community prioritises marginalised people's safety over privileged people's comfort. This is really imprecise. The sentence that has now been removed that caused all the problems followed this. The Gnome community prioritises marginal people's safety over privileged people's comfort. And it said, the committee will not act on complaints regarding these things below. Now that's been removed, and I'm not surprised it's been removed because it was really poorly worded. Essentially what it was there to say was, If you happen to be a privileged person, tough. Now, there was lots of arguments that it didn't mean that at all, but it was too easy to interpret it that way. Anyway, that's been taken out now, and it just says that it's just shortened the sentence, really. And it's talking about reverse-isms, including reverse racism, reverse sexism, and cisphobia. So reverse racism, I'm assuming, and again, we're in imprecise territory here, that you're saying as a white person you're being discriminated against for some reason, or as a man, I suppose, reverse sexism. Might not just be about a male, could be a trans person, but it's difficult, isn't it? I'm not exactly sure what it means. If you're saying that you are being discriminated against because you are a white male, apparently the Gnome community is not going to prioritise that. Cisphobia, what an expression. I mean, I've seen it, but I didn't really know what it meant. And apparently cisgender means if you identify with the biological sex that you were born with. Okay, so that's a cis. I don't know why it's cis. I don't know where it came from. To be honest, I'm not interested. It's a strange word, and I don't know why we need it. Cisphobia, apparently, is when somebody does identify with the sex that they were born with, and you believe you are being discriminated because of that, because communities that don't fall within that cisgendered space have a phobia against you. I've probably got that completely wrong, but this is the problem, isn't it? They're using these terms that you have to go and look up and do research for to find out what they actually mean. The fact that, from my perspective as a white middle-aged male, I'm assuming that that means that I'm not marginalised, but I'm privileged. Now, this is problematic in a whole range of ways, because to assume that, for instance, all white males are privileged forgets the fact that, you know, many areas of white, or many white males may be very poor. They may be, they may suffer all sorts of disadvantages and disabilities that could make them far from privileged. So it's just sweeping statements. It's dreadful. I hate it. What else does it say? Reasonable communication of boundaries, such as leave me. Okay, that's fine. Criticising racist, sexist, or cis-sexist, another word you'd have to look up, or otherwise oppressive behaviour or assumptions, and communicating boundaries or criticising behaviour, oppressive behaviour, in a tone you don't find congenial. Okay, this really... Gnome, you had it coming by wording something like this. And I wouldn't have been surprised if this was copied and pasted straight out of another code of conduct that's out there somewhere. It's its imprecise nature that is the problem here. And it does suggest that if you fall within a particular group where you're classed as a privileged person, well, you're not really going to be prioritised. Almost to make matters worse, though, you get to the end here and it says basic expectations for conduct are not covered by the reverse-ism clause and would be enforced irrespective of the demographics of those involved. For example, racial discrimination will not be tolerated irrespective of the race of those involved. So do they mean that even reverse racism wouldn't be tolerated? I really don't know. There seems to be a clash here, and it's not clear to me exactly what it's saying. So that was quite an awkward video to produce. I felt like I was treading on eggshells throughout some of that, and I've tried to be as objective as possible, but it's quite difficult to look at something like this and not come out with strong views. I think my overall feeling is no, it doesn't do the job. The new code of conduct isn't fit for purpose. I think the previous one was. I think the previous one, to be honest, was probably too complex. Why not just follow something simple like a statement? Be nice. Be nice to each other. Or what does Brian Lunduke say? Be excellent to each other. That's all that's required. I don't think we need a long document setting up so many rules and so many clauses that it almost does seem to be, a statement of social control that is only going to have the knock-on effect that everybody feels uncomfortable because you almost don't know how to behave or what to say, or you're so worried that if you do say something, it could be interpreted wrongly by someone else, and then, you're going to get complaints and be complained about. That's my feeling, and it tends to emphasise difference over those things that unite us, and it's just so imprecise, it does itself no favours. So definitely not fit for purpose. I'm sure you'll disagree and let me know in the comments. Anyway, I would like to just say I hope you enjoyed the video. I don't know what my feelings are. I'm still thinking maybe I shouldn't have done this. Come and join me on Library. Come and join me on the Facebook group. And I'd like to say a special thank you to my Patreons. So Robert, Gary, Corbinian, Aristotelis, Stormpick, Stephen Cross, Mike Long, Dave Bird, Entropy UK, Richard Wade, Tiger, Philip Espy, Forrest, Patrick, Glenn and Magnus. Cheers, guys. Your support really helps. That's it for today. See you next week.